Scientists in the United States and the world have reached an overwhelming consensus that climate change is real and caused primarily by human activity. Burning fossil fuels such as coal, oil, and natural gas to generate energy has had the greatest impact. Coal is especially damaging to our atmosphere, releasing 70% more carbon dioxide than natural gas for every unit of energy produced. Hello, we are the Climate Works Foundation. We are here to discuss the issue of climate change, describe the impact, and propose possible solutions, taking into account the interests of the international community. A stable climate is necessary for ecosystems, economies, and societies to thrive. Climate change is real, an imminent problem that is already affecting the ecosystems, economies, and communities in which we live. The stability of our planet is at risk as a result of climate change. Climate change is a significant challenge that adds considerable stress to our society and the environment. From shifting weather patterns that threaten food production to rising sea levels that increase the risk of catastrophic flooding, the impacts of climate change are global in scope and unprecedented in scale. The rise of industrialization has driven up quantities of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. As populations, economies, and standards of living grow, so does the cumulative level of greenhouse gas emissions. These greenhouse gases act like a blanket for the atmosphere. The thicker the blanket, the warmer our planet becomes. Changes in climate not only affect average temperatures, but also extreme temperatures, increasing the likelihood of weather-related natural disasters. The first decade of the 21st century saw 3,496 natural disasters from floods, storms, droughts, and heat waves. That was nearly 5 times as many disasters as the 743 catastrophes reported during the 1970s. More frequent and intense natural disasters can directly harm animals, destroy the places they live, and wreak havoc on people's livelihoods and communities. To avoid the worst effects of climate change, we need to dramatically reduce global carbon emissions, and we must also prepare for the significant and unavoidable consequences of carbon emissions. Climate change is already beginning to transform life on this planet. Without drastic action, the impacts of climate change will continue to catastrophically damage the world we live in. We can prevent the most disruptive consequences of climate change if we act with urgency and determination to transform the practices that drive greenhouse gas emissions.
The Paris Agreement has become a global commitment to reduce the threat climate change poses to us all around the world. It has become a global agreement that no country is immune to climate change, which means that no country should tackle this issue alone. Some positive outcomes of this agreement are that it brings nations together and rally behind a common cause to undertake ambitious efforts to combat climate change. It also includes enhanced support to assist developing countries. As such, it charts a new course in the global climate effort. Second, the agreement also highlights the potential of having the global community prioritize innovation, improvement of infrastructures, but also revitalize economies. With all of this, we are able to allow our government to deliver what the people want, which is to live in an overall better country. The agreement itself stands as a positive step towards change, but still has one issue which weakens the agreement. As the agreement stands right now, there are no harsh penalties for countries who do not follow through with the agreement or decide to exit. As we all know, one of the world's biggest superpowers has left the agreement. The current administration's decision to pull the United States out of the Paris Agreement is a blow to climate action, an act of poor leadership, but most importantly, harmful to America's international reputation. Despite being one of the world's biggest superpowers pulling out, it has opened the door for other countries to step in and move forward regardless. With the Paris Agreement and its entirety, we expect to see positive results which will hopefully lead to technology leadership, job growth, economic development, clean air and water, vibrant cities, sustainable agriculture, and better public health. At ClimateWorks Foundation, we share the values of the Paris Agreement and are working diligently on ways to improve the environment we live in. Our foundation has become the nucleus in cutting-edge research which has helped thousands of other organizations build their capacity in key regions to combat climate change. Since our establishment in 2008, we have identified priorities and projects that, when utilized, will save lives, energy, and mitigate climate change by 2030. It takes a large investment now, but the benefits will be reaped by all. For example, in a development project case study in India, by just deploying 1,000 kilometers of a new bus rapid transit line over 20 cities in India, it created more than 128,000 jobs and reduced black carbon by 5 to 6 tons. We call for early mitigation and systematic changes when it comes to climate change. Next, we will focus on 3 different methods to do that, starting with climate policy, sustainable finance, and communications and public engagement.
To avoid effects of climate change, we must reduce global greenhouse gas emissions to an annual total of 35 billion metric tons by 2030, eventually cutting net emissions to zero. This will require governments, private entities, civil society, and other stakeholders to work together to do their part. At ClimateWorks, we aggregate, synthesize, and present emissions data and political, social, technical, and economic analyses in a way that offers insight for climate philanthropy. These insights help funders prioritize opportunities to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, develop strategies that are robust under different future scenarios, adapt strategies to changing conditions, and track progress towards climate goals. Our 3-pronged approach is focused on climate policy, sustainable finance, and communication and public engagement. By utilizing cross-cutting strategies in the policy arena, ClimateWorks and its partners proactively encourage the adoption and implementation of ambitious climate policies in high-priority regions. One specific policy measure that ClimateWorks supports is the Carbon Transparency Initiative, which helps decision makers within the climate community project and track progress towards a low-carbon economy by analyzing emission trends. It provides access to reliable, consistent information to improve strategies and track the progress of those strategies over time. There are 3 components to the Carbon Transparency Initiative. The first, the ClimateWorks Tracker, is a website that allows users to evaluate current progress and greenhouse gas emission trends. Second, Carbon Transparency Initiative models incorporate a broad set of data within our detailed methodology to determine greenhouse gas emission pathways across all sectors. And finally, the ClimateWorks Advisory Services. Our advisory services include customized analyses, collaboration, and support from our ClimateWorks team to help our partners make investments to reduce emissions and to track the progress of those investments. The Carbon Transparency Initiative is a valuable tool for collaboration, helping ensure that regional strategies complement each other. In addition to the Carbon Transparency Initiative, policies supporting new business models and building codes are integral to reducing carbon emissions. Because the world population is expected to grow by over 1.1 billion, with the majority of that growth in urban areas in China, India, and North America, we need to think strategically about how we build the structures that will hold the growing population. At ClimateWorks, we focus on implementing step-by-step best practices in key economic sectors and in nations capable of producing the most carbon reductions. For example, we are currently supporting efforts to upgrade cement factories in China, as cement production contributes nearly 5% of all global carbon emissions. We must also focus on adopting stricter energy codes and requirements for efficiency upgrades to reduce the energy use and emissions of new buildings, implementing targets for building renovations, adopting zero emissions by 2050 policy roadmaps, developing professional planning and design training tools to dramatically improve building construction and renovation worldwide, and the implementation of pilot projects, particularly in urban areas, to scale up best practice construction and retrofit business models.
Now that you've heard about areas we can improve climate policy, let's go into how to fund projects that will make this happen. Sustainable finance is the provision of finance where investors consider environmental, social, and governance when creating portfolios. Climate Works specializes in portfolios focused on clean power, energy efficiency, forest, land use, and more. Coordinating philanthropists, governments, and hedge funds with sustainable finance investment opportunities gives accessible income to companies working on clean energy sources and infrastructure. Research has found that it will take as much as $1 trillion in annual investments to reach the Paris Agreement's goals. One of the main factors in this is reducing investments in industries like oil and putting those funds into energy-efficient investments. By supporting low-carbon alternatives, investors and philanthropists can push our world towards carbon neutrality. Okay, one recent example is Norway. Norway is a forerunner in the movement away from the oil and gas sector. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is the largest sovereign fund in the world, holding over $900 billion in assets. In 2015, they quit investing in companies that derive more than one-third of their revenue from coal. Today, 6% of the fund is in oil and gas stocks, or $37 billion. But the nation recently announced its plan to divert all funds from the sector. This means Norway is planning to decrease investment in inefficient energy and hopefully move it into more sustainable areas like clean energy and infrastructure and transportation projects. Norway should be able to increase renewable energy investments from $5 to $8 billion now to $23 billion in the coming years. Not only will these investments in turn decrease emissions, but they will give great monetary and social returns to their nation. After seeing how sustainable finance is necessary to decreasing CO2 emissions, we need to talk about how to get the public engaged in pushing for actions like these.
According to one study conducted by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication and the George Mason University Center for Climate Change Communication, only 13% of citizens from the United States correctly identified that more than 90% of all climate scientists believe that climate change is caused by human impact. While Climate Works' mission is to collaborate with funders, regional and research partners, and other climate leaders to strengthen philanthropy's response to climate change, a key part to solving climate change is obviously making sure people understand the science behind the issue and realize that yes, climate change really is happening. As long as there are a significant number of doubters, especially within countries which produce a significant amount of CO2 emissions, such as the US, the ever-growing global climate crisis cannot be solved. However, with a new and improved communication strategy and an increase in public engagement, Climate Works, in conjunction with the rest of the international community, can begin to eradicate the myth that climate change does not exist and finally begin to make progress with the aforementioned three-pronged strategy to combat this global crisis. As just mentioned, only a fraction of U.S. citizens understand the enormity of this global pandemic. However, you may ask, if this is a global crisis, why so much focus on the United States? Because the U.S. placed number 2 in CO2 emissions for the entire globe, it is a top priority for Climate Works in terms of communication strategy and public engagement. In fact, the basis of our strategy will focus around the top 5 CO2 emitters worldwide, including China, the US, India, Russia, and Japan.
While we will conduct our educational campaign throughout the entire world, our primary focus will be on these 5 nations, considering that number 1, they offer the biggest return on investment, and number 2, they are each powerful nations in a position to set an example for the rest of the world. Specifically, our communication strategy will utilize the following 3 steps. Number 1, target a young demographic to create a more socially aware and environmentally conscious future generation. Number 2, outline consequences which could affect the day-to-day lives of people specific to the region in which they live, so the content is more relatable. And number 3, bring in educated global ambassadors from Latin America, the region of the world with the highest proportion of individuals who believe in climate change, so that doubters can understand the implications of climate change from a more global perspective. Because climate change is such a complicated global issue, we are bound to have challenges and pushbacks within our overall strategy and efforts. We believe that our top 2 challenges will be, number 1, receiving negative feedback from local and national governments currently relying on unsustainable resources or ways of life in general, and number 2, pushback from politicians who believe the changes required to combat climate change will have negative implications for both the national and international economic system. However, to combat challenge number 1, we will implement a proactive approach by rolling out our global educational campaign prior to implementing any concrete changes in international climate policy in order to best minimize negative feedback. And in reference to challenge number 2, we will send in our global ambassadors to meet with politicians around the world to establish a strong, united front to help them understand how much stronger and sustainable their economies will be once they are relying on a more sustainable means of both fuel and resources.
There is no denying climate change has become a global problem. No country is able to turn away from being part of the solution to combat climate change. When we come together, we are not only able to share the responsibility in solving this issue, but learn on how together we can prevent our planet from becoming unlivable for future generations. With our projects and areas of focus at the Climate Works Foundation, we believe a dramatic change of how we use clean power, drive our cars, build our buildings, and treat our land will make a lifelong impact to make sure that our planet is prosperous for years to come. Thank you.